The straw was thin where she'd flattened it, and the cold came up through it anyway. Hannah had learned, in the 2 winters since the war, that cold had a personality. It didn't just settle. It searched. It found the gap between her collar and her neck, the torn hem of her cloak, the place on her left side where the fabric had worn through entirely. She'd stuffed that hole with dried grass weeks ago. The grass had compressed to nothing. She hadn't found time to replace it. She lay curled in the narrow space behind the discard bins, in the shadow corridor between the royal kitchen's back wall and the old stone fence that divided the servant yards from the castle proper. It was not a shelter, exactly. It was a forgotten place, and forgotten places, she had learned, were the only safe ones for girls like her. The smell was always the same, a rotting vegetable ends, the sour, yeasty ghost of bread that had gone bad before anyone could use it. Underneath it all, the sharp iron edge of a northern wind that no wall, however thick, could fully keep out. Her stomach made a sound she had stopped being embarrassed by. She pressed her hand flat against it, not to silence it, but because the pressure helped. Tricked the body, just a little. Made it think something had happened. Nothing had happened. She had not eaten since the morning of the previous day, and even that had been small. A heel of bread someone had dropped near the lower market. She had hesitated 3 full seconds before picking it up. She always hesitated. It felt important to hesitate, as though the pause was the last thread of dignity she still held. "I'm sorry," she had whispered, to no one, before she put it in her mouth. She whispered that often. To the bins she stole from. To the guards whose backs she slipped past. To the memory of her mother, who had raised her to be better than this, and who had not survived the war long enough to see what this had become. Hannah was an Omega. In the Blackridge pack, that word carried a weight most people never thought about, because they never had to. It meant no rank, no protection, no voice in any room that mattered. It meant you worked when work was given, and starved when it wasn't. It meant that the law, which punished theft, applied to you at full severity, while the law that was supposed to protect you seemed written in a language no one remembered how to read. After the war, it had gotten worse. The Northern Campaign had lasted 14 months, and taken nearly a third of the pack's fighting wolves. What remained of the kingdom was held together by the iron will of one man, Alpha King Reed Brennan, and by the kind of austerity that looked like order from the top, and looked like slow death from the bottom. Resources were rationed. Movement was monitored. The lower districts, where the Omegas were quietly crowded after the rebuilding effort claimed their former quarters, had become a place the rest of the pack did not speak of unless they had to. Hannah had been surviving in them for 8 months. She had memorized the royal kitchen's rhythms the way other people memorized prayers. The head cook arrived before dawn. The scullery workers came in 2 rotations, one at midday, one at the closing hour. The discard bins were emptied every morning before the first light, which meant the narrow window between the guard's change and the cook's arrival was the only time the back corridor was unwatched. 17 minutes, 18 on good nights. She had it down to a sequence. Count the steps from the wall gap, 3 seconds to check the doorway, 5 seconds to assess the bins, 12 to take only what no one would count, and then back into the dark before the cold lantern light from the upper corridor reached the floor. She never took more than she could carry in her cloak without it showing. She always whispered sorry. It had worked, for months. It had worked. But tonight, as she eased herself upright and pressed her back against the stone, she felt something she hadn't felt before. The air had changed. She stood still for a moment. Her fingers were already numb, which made it harder to be certain. But there was a quality to the silence that was different. Not empty, the way silence usually was in the pre-dawn cold, but full. Weighted with something she had no word for. The hairs at the back of her neck rose one by one. "Don't be foolish," she told herself. "You've done this 100 times." She moved. The back door was unlatched, the way it always was at this hour. She slipped through it without touching the frame. The kitchen was dark except for the low orange glow of the banked hearth, and the smell hit her first. Warm bread, rendered fat, the faint sweetness of something honeyed left too close to the heat. Her stomach contracted so sharply she nearly made a sound. She crossed to the bins without breathing. Her hands found the familiar shapes. Bread ends, a crock with something dried at the rim, the heel of what had once been a roast, mostly bone. Enough. She pulled her cloak open to tuck it away. And then she felt it. Eyes. Not the casual gaze of a guard doing rounds, not the distracted glance of a scullery boy who hadn't fully woken yet. This was deliberate. Patient. The kind of attention that had been waiting. Her hands stilled. She made herself turn slowly. At the far end of the kitchen, where the archway opened into the inner corridor of the castle, a silhouette stood in the dark. Still. Enormous. Completely, terribly unhurried. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She could not see his face, but she could feel the weight of him, the particular unmistakable pressure of alpha dominance, old and dense as iron, pressing against her skin like a second cold. The bread slipped from her fingers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She ran. He stayed in the archway long after the sound of her footsteps had faded. The kitchen settled back into its silence. The low pop of the banked hearth, the distant moan of wind finding the roof joints, the absolute stillness of a castle that did not yet know it was morning. Reed Brennan stood with his arms crossed and his back against the stone, and looked at the place where she had been. The bread she had dropped lay near the base of the bin. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked away. They called him the Iron Sovereign in the lower kingdoms. In Blackridge, his own people used simpler language. The king, the alpha, and when they thought no one important was listening, the wall, as in immovable, as in nothing gets through. He had heard all of it, and had never bothered to correct any of it. Because a reputation built from fear was still a reputation. And reputation was one of the few things that kept a kingdom from bleeding out in the years after a war. He had made decisions during the Northern Campaign that he did not regret. He needed to be precise about that, because precision mattered. Not regretting something was not the same as being untouched by it. He had sacrificed the eastern flank. 300 wolves, redirected into territory they could not hold, buying time for the main force to push the rogue advance back from the capital. It had worked. The capital stood. The pack survived. The 300 did not. He knew their names. He had memorized them the week after, methodically, the way he did everything. Because forgetting felt like a second betrayal, and he had decided he was only permitted one. He still woke sometimes at the hour before dawn, and lay in the dark, with the list moving behind his eyes like water. It was why he walked the castle at night. Not because he couldn't sleep. He had trained himself past that particular weakness years ago. He walked because stillness, in the dark, in a quiet room, left too much space for the list. Movement kept it at bay. The kitchens, the lower corridors, the old eastern stairwell that no one used anymore. He had mapped them all in his own private insomnia, turning the castle into a circuit he ran when the nights grew heavy. He had first seen her 6 weeks ago. A shape in the back corridor, moving in a way that was almost liquid. Low, careful, nothing wasted. He had registered her as a threat before he registered her as a person, which was instinct. And then he had registered her as an omega, which was information. And then he had watched her hands and understood what she was doing. And something in him had gone very quiet. She took the bread ends, the bones, the vegetable scraps that had gone soft. She left the preserved meats entirely. She left the cheese. She left a full crock of rendered fat that could have been traded in the lower market for 3 days of real food, and which he knew, because he knew the lower market's exchange rates, she almost certainly needed. She took only what no one was counting. He had stood in the archway and watched, and had not moved, and had not spoken, and had not been able to explain it to himself in any terms that made immediate strategic sense. She was trespassing in the royal kitchen. The law was not ambiguous on the matter. His beta commander would have had her removed, documented, and processed before she'd drawn a second breath. Reed had let her fill her cloak and run. He had gone back to his rooms and sat at his desk and looked at the wall for a while. Then he had gone back the next night. Torrin found him the following morning, which was Torrin's particular talent, appearing at the exact moment Reed least wanted company, wearing the expression of a man who believed inconvenient truths were a form of loyalty. "The kitchen reports are inconsistent," Torrin said, setting a document on the table without being invited to. "Bread counts, bone stock, the discard tallies don't match the waste logs." "How large is the discrepancy?" "Small. Like that's what concerns me." Torrin's jaw was set in the way it got when he'd already decided something and was waiting for Reed to agree. A large theft is clumsy. Small, consistent, targeted discrepancies suggest someone who knows what they're doing, someone who's been inside more than once. Reed looked at the document without picking it up. "You want an investigation? I want to post additional guards on the kitchen corridor. Night rotation, back entrance." "No." Torrin's expression didn't change, which meant it wanted to. "Alpha." "I said no." Reed set the document aside. "Increase the morning inventory checks if it concerns you. The back corridor stays as it is." There was a pause. The specific pause Torrin used when he was deciding how far to push. He had served Reed for 11 years. He knew, generally, where the line was. "As you say," he said, and left. Reed ordered the investigation Torrin wanted. A quiet one, pointed at the lower districts, asking the kind of general questions that produced no useful answers. It would satisfy the paperwork. It would satisfy Torrin's need to feel the kingdom was responding appropriately. It would find nothing. Because that night, Reed dismissed the kitchen guard 2 hours earlier than usual, and took up his position in the archway himself, and waited. He told himself he was assessing a security risk. He told himself he wanted to understand the full pattern before taking action. He stood in the dark and watched the back door and did not examine either of those explanations very carefully. The cold deepened. The hearth ticked and settled. Then, quiet as breath, careful as prayer, the back door opened. She slipped through it the way she always did, not touching the frame. Her cloak was the same one, the torn left hem trailing, the right side pulled close. Her hands found the bins without hesitation. Reed didn't move. She was thinner than he'd first registered. The lantern light from the hearth caught the side of her face as she turned, and he could see the hollow beneath her cheekbone that hadn't been there in women who were eating enough. Her fingers were quick and economical, wrapping the scraps without fumbling, but her hands were shaking. Not from guilt, he realized, from cold, from exhaustion, from the specific tremor of a body spending everything it had left just to keep upright. She took less than usual tonight. He didn't know why that made something tighten in his chest. She gathered her cloak closed, turned toward the door, and stopped. He watched her go still, watched the way her shoulders changed, a barely perceptible shift, the animal awareness of being observed. She knew. She had some instinct that was still working even when the rest of her was failing. She didn't run this time. For 3 full seconds she stood with her back to him, not running, not speaking. Then she walked out the door. Reed exhaled slowly through his nose. He uncrossed his arms, looked at the bin, looked at the door. He came back the next night. She almost didn't come back. She had spent the better part of 2 days arguing herself out of it, standing in the narrow lean-to off the lower district's east wall, which passed for shelter in the way that a cupped hand passes for a bowl, and listing every reason the kitchen was no longer safe. He had seen her. Twice. A large, still, unmistakably powerful silhouette that could only be one thing in a castle like that. At that hour. In that corridor. She didn't let herself think the name. Thinking the name made it more real than she could afford. She ate the last of what she'd taken, slowly, in careful portions, the way she'd trained herself to, making it last. And when it was gone, she sat with her back against the cold stone and listened to her stomach and thought about probability. The probability that he would report her, that enforcers would come, that the next time she visited the kitchen, the back entrance would be guarded and the guards would not be the kind who looked away. She thought about this for a long time. Then hunger made the decision for her, the way it always did in the end. Hunger was not interested in probability. Hunger was blunt and absolute, and it did not argue. It simply became loud enough that every other thought had to speak over it, and eventually nothing else could be heard at all. She went back on the third night. She came through the door more slowly than usual. 1 step, then a pause. 2 steps, then stillness, reading the air the way you learned to read it when stillness was the difference between safe and not. The kitchen was quiet. The hearth burned low. Nothing moved. She let herself breathe. She crossed to the bins and stopped. Something was different. The scraps were there, the way they always were, but they were arranged differently. Not the careless heap of a day's discards, but something closer to order. The bread ends were dry as usual, but set to one side. The bones were wrapped loosely in cloth. And on top, placed deliberately, unmistakably deliberately, because nothing in a discard bin sat like that on its own, was a small loaf of bread. Not a heel. Not a leftover portion. A whole loaf, modest in size, still holding the faint warmth of an oven that hadn't fully cooled. Hannah stared at it. Her first thought, immediate and practical, was that it was a trap. Bait. That someone had placed it there to confirm she was real, and then the door behind her would open and that would be the end of it. She waited. Nothing moved. No door opened. Her second thought was that someone had made an error, left it in the wrong place, that it wasn't meant for her at all. But it was sitting precisely where her hands always reached first. She had a precise routine, and whatever had placed this loaf knew it. Her fingers touched the crust. Then, because she had not eaten in a day, and her hands were already shaking, and some thresholds once crossed cannot be uncrossed, she picked it up. She ate standing at the bin, in small, careful pieces, because old habits don't release their grip simply because circumstances change. But the bread was real, and it was warm, and there was a moment, somewhere in the middle of it, when she closed her eyes and simply felt the heat of it move down through her chest. And for a few seconds, the cold and the noise and the weight of surviving went somewhere quieter. And there was only this. She didn't hear herself make a sound. But something escaped her. Small, involuntary. Something between a breath and a word. She opened her eyes, and knew, with the certainty of an animal that has survived long enough to trust its instincts absolutely, that she was not alone. She turned her head slowly toward the archway. He was there. Same stillness. Same darkness. The hearth light didn't reach him fully, but it reached enough. The line of a jaw, the set of broad shoulders, arms crossed in a posture that was not threatening, precisely, but was not casual either. A man entirely at ease with his own authority, watching her with an attention that was focused and unreadable and gave nothing away. She should have run. Her feet didn't move. They looked at each other across the length of the kitchen. She with half a loaf still warm in her hands, he without expression, without demand, without any of the things she had been bracing for since the first night he'd appeared in that doorway. The silence stretched. She counted her own heartbeats inside it. Then she looked down at the bread in her hands, back up at the shadow in the archway. "Thank you," she whispered. It was barely sound, more breath than word. He said nothing. But something shifted in the dark. A barely perceptible thing. Less movement than its absence. Like a man who had been holding attention he hadn't known he was carrying, and had, without meaning to, let it go. Reed Brennan stood in the archway of his own kitchen, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time move quietly through his chest. He didn't have a name for it yet. He didn't reach for one. He simply stood there in the dark, watching her finish the bread, and did not move until she was long gone. The work assignment came without warning, the way most things did in the lower districts. A beta overseer appeared at the lean-to before dawn. Not Hannah's overseer, someone else's, which meant the regular crews were short, and they were pulling anyone available, and told her to report to the castle's outer wall for stone clearing. The Rogue War had left sections of the northern perimeter damaged, and the rebuilding effort moved in phases, and this phase apparently required Omega hands to shift rubble so that the higher-ranked workers could do the parts that mattered. She went. She always went. Refusal wasn't a choice that existed for her in any practical sense. The work was brutal in the way that cold, repetitive labor is brutal. Not dramatic, not violent, simply relentless. Lifting and carrying and stacking hour after hour in a wind that had decided to be personal about it. By midday, her shoulders were burning, but by the afternoon, her grip was failing in ways she kept compensating for, shifting weight onto her forearms, her wrists, adjusting constantly. She didn't notice how close she was to the edge of the scaffolding until she wasn't on it anymore. It was only a short drop, 6 feet, maybe 7, onto packed frozen earth. Not the kind of fall that killed you, just the kind that reminded you, comprehensively, that your body was a physical object with edges and limits and a finite amount of tolerance for today. She lay still for a moment, cataloging. Her hip had caught the worst of it. Her left forearm had gone down instinctively to break the landing, and something along the outer edge of it had torn. She could feel the warm wet of it before she could see it, soaking into the already dark fabric of her sleeve. Someone above called down, not with concern, with impatience. Was she able to continue? She called back that she was. She finished the shift. She almost didn't go to the kitchen that night. Told herself she would rest, would go the following evening instead, would be sensible about it. Then she tried to sleep, and the cold and the pain kept interrupting each other, and sensible stopped being a compelling argument around the second hour. She went. She moved more slowly than usual through the back corridor. Her weight shifted subtly to the right. Her left arm held slightly away from her body. The tear had slowed to seeping, but it hadn't stopped, and she'd wrapped it with a strip of her undershirt that was doing a reasonable job of being a bandage and an inadequate job of being clean. The kitchen was warm. The loaf was there again. She had stopped questioning the loaf. It appeared she was grateful. Those were the operative facts, and she had decided they were enough. She reached for it with her right hand, and in shifting her weight, her left arm pressed against the bin edge, and the sound she made was quiet but involuntary. She stilled immediately, pressed her lips together, waited for the pain to subside to its previous, more manageable level. Movement from the archway. Not the settled stillness she had come to recognize. Movement, deliberate, coming toward her. Every instinct lit up at once. She stepped back, her right hand coming up in the involuntary gesture of someone who has learned that people moving toward them quickly are generally not bringing good news. "I'll go," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I'll leave right now. I won't come back. Sit down." 2 words, not loud, not cruel. The tone of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed and had never found it necessary to shout about it. She sat, on the low stool near the hearth, because her legs made the decision before her mind finished arguing, and watched him cross the kitchen with the particular wariness of someone waiting to learn exactly what form the consequence was going to take. He crouched in front of her, not looming, not performing authority, simply level with her, which was somehow more disorienting than if he'd stood over her. He reached for her left arm. She flinched. He paused. 1 beat. Then continued, his grip careful, turning her arm to the light with a deliberateness that was almost clinical. He unwrapped the strip of undershirt, looked at what was underneath, and said nothing. Then he stood, moved to the kitchen's supply shelf, and came back with a clean cloth and something in a small crock that smelled astringent and medicinal. He opened the crock, applied it with the focused attention of someone who had done this before, on worse wounds, and had not lost the habit of precision. It stung. She didn't make a sound. He wrapped the cloth around her forearm, firm and even, and tied it off with a neatness that suggested this was not, for him, an unfamiliar task. She stared at the side of his face throughout all of it, the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar along his left temple she hadn't been close enough to notice before. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on his work, methodical, unhurried. When he was done, he didn't move away immediately, just remained crouched, looking at the bandage, as though checking it against some internal standard. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine question, carrying the particular bewilderment of someone for whom unexpected kindness had become harder to process than cruelty. He didn't answer. He stood, set the crock back on the shelf, the way a man puts something away when he's done with a task and moving on to the next. He didn't look at her again. He walked back to the archway, and then he was gone, back into the inner corridor, into the dark, as though he had simply been passing through and the whole thing had been incidental. Hannah sat on the stool beside the hearth with her newly bandaged arm in her lap and looked at the empty archway for a long time. She thought about the loaf appearing on top of the bin, the kitchen corridor that somehow stayed unguarded at the right hours, the silhouette that watched without reporting, night after night. And now this. Clean cloth, careful hands, a crock of medicine that had not been cheap to source. The pieces arranged themselves slowly, the way things do when you've been refusing to look at them directly. There was only one person in this castle with the authority to leave a corridor unguarded. Only one person whose presence in the kitchen at that hour would go unquestioned. Only one person who could watch an Omega steal from the royal bins for weeks and choose, deliberately, to do nothing. The bread slipped from her fingers again. The king, she thought. It's been the king. It became a thing with a shape, not an agreement. They had never spoken enough to agree on anything. Not a routine, exactly, because routines implied intention, and neither of them had acknowledged intending anything at all. But it had a shape, the way a path has a shape after enough people have walked the same ground without discussing it. You could see the outline of it, if you looked. He waited. She came. The kitchen held them both in its low warmth for a while, and then she left. And he stayed, and neither of them mentioned it the next time. The first real conversation happened by accident, the way most true things do. She had been eating. The portions had gotten better gradually, incrementally, in the particular way that change happens when someone is trying not to be noticed making it. The bread was consistently fresh now. There had been dried fruit twice. Once, a small wrapped portion of soft cheese that she had held for a full minute before allowing herself to believe it was real. She knew who was responsible. She had known for 9 days. She hadn't said anything about it because saying something would make it a different kind of thing, and she wasn't certain she was ready for that. That night she was eating near the hearth, and the fire shifted and sent up a brief warm light, and without planning to, she said, "It's quieter than I expected. The castle. At night." She wasn't sure why she said it. It was simply there in the silence, and the silence had begun to feel less like absence and more like a held breath, and something in her was tired of holding it. A pause from the archway. More than, "Most people are afraid of it." His voice at low volume was different than she'd expected. Less command in it, more texture, like stone that had been worn smooth by a long time of weather. "The quiet?" she asked. "The castle?" She looked at the fire. "I'm afraid of the castle." "I know." Another silence. Not uncomfortable exactly, just careful. "You don't seem afraid of much," she said. The pause before his answer was longer this time. That's not the same as having nothing to fear. She didn't push at it. He didn't offer more. They let it rest where it had landed, which felt surprisingly like the right thing. She began to notice the food in a different way after that. Not just that it was better. She'd registered that already. But what was better? And why? The dried fruit was high in iron. The cheese was dense with fat and protein. The bread had seeds pressed into the crust she recognized from the market as expensive. Whoever was selecting these things was not selecting them randomly. They were selected the way you select things when you know something about the body receiving them, when you have looked at someone and understood what they are missing. She sat with that knowledge quietly. It felt too large to look at directly. On the 14th night, she brought something with her. Not much. A few portions of the dried fruit she'd saved across 3 nights, wrapped in a square of cloth. She set them beside the bin before she took anything else. For the kitchen workers, she said, to no one in particular. The ones on the early shift, they start before the meal is served. She felt his attention shift in the dark. Sharper, somehow. She didn't explain further. She had seen the early shift workers, Omegas, most of them, who arrived before the main household stirred and were expected to have the kitchen running before anyone thought to wonder whether they'd eaten. She had been an early shift worker, in the months right after the war. She remembered the specific arithmetic of that hunger. She took her own portions and left. Behind her, she heard nothing. But the next night, the early shift bin had been quietly, deniably restocked. She was careful not to think about what it meant. She was less successful at not thinking about him, which was the more dangerous problem, and she knew it. He was the Alpha King. She was an Omega who was technically committing a crime every time she walked through his back door. Whatever was happening in this kitchen in the quiet hours existed in a space between the law and his decision to ignore it, and that space was entirely his to close at any moment. She had no power in it. That was the truth she returned to when the other thoughts got too warm. She had no power, and that meant she had no safety. Not really. And caring about someone who held that much of your fate in their hands was not a feeling. It was a vulnerability. She was already too vulnerable. She knew this. She reminded herself of it on each of the 17 steps from the wall gap to the kitchen door, and forgot it again approximately 30 seconds after the warmth of the hearth reached her face, which told her something she didn't particularly want to know about the state of her own defenses. Torin came to Reed's study on a Tuesday. She didn't know it was Tuesday. She learned the rest of it later, in pieces, the way you learn the things that were decided about you in rooms you weren't in. What she knew that night was this. She was in the lower corridor collecting the linen scraps she'd traded 2 hours of labor for when 2 castle guards passed close enough that she had to press into the wall gap to avoid being seen. They were mid-conversation, the comfortable, careless speech of men who believed themselves unobserved. Commander Torin's pushing hard this time, wants a full sweep of the back entrances. All of them? Kitchen corridor specifically. He says the Alpha's been stalling the investigation. A short laugh. Not for long, I'd wager. Torin doesn't stall. Their voices faded down the hall. Hannah stood in the wall gap with the linen pressed against her chest, and the cold finding her, again, through all the places she hadn't managed to patch. She thought about the bread, the cheese, the careful bandage on her arm, still faintly visible as a slight stiffness when she flexed her wrist in the cold. She thought about 17 steps and a warm hearth, and a voice that said, "That's not the same as having nothing to fear." Then she thought about what happened to Omegas when Beta commanders ran their investigations. She went home. She lay on her flattened straw and stared at the dark above her, and understood, with a clarity that felt like something closing, that she could not go back. She had known this line existed. She just hadn't expected it to hurt this much to stop crossing it. He told himself the first night, and that it was nothing. She had missed before, twice in the early weeks, when the weather had been particularly brutal, and even the 17-step journey from wall gap to kitchen door was more than a body running on almost nothing could reasonably manage. He had waited both times, noted her absence without examining what the noting felt like, and she had returned the following night thinner and more careful, and things had continued. So he waited. The hearth burned low. The bread sat on the bin where he had placed it. She didn't come. He left at the usual hour and told himself it was nothing. The second night, he arrived earlier. He didn't acknowledge why. Simply found himself in the archway before the kitchen had fully settled into its night quiet, in the particular way that the body moves toward things the mind hasn't yet admitted it wants. He stood in his usual position, arms crossed, patient. The patience was a practiced thing, and it held for a long time. Then it became something else. Not impatience, exactly. A quality of attention that was no longer comfortable. A stillness that was working harder than usual to stay still. The bread cooled. He left later than he should have and took the long route back to his rooms, which passed the window that faced the eastern outer wall, and stood at it for a moment looking at the dark geometry of his own kingdom in the snow. He told himself she had simply chosen to stop coming. That this was, in fact, the most rational outcome. That Torin's pressure had reached her somehow, which meant the situation had resolved itself without requiring him to make a decision he'd been successfully avoiding. He told himself this, and found it entirely unconvincing. The third night, he didn't bother with the archway. He stood at the back entrance itself, which he had never done before, and looked at the wall gap she used, 30 yards out, just visible in the moonlight reflecting off the snow. He watched it for a long time. Nothing moved through it. Something was wrong. He had spent 11 years making decisions under pressure, reading situations through incomplete information, and trusting the particular instinct that lived below calculation and above feeling. That instinct was speaking now in a register he recognized. Not alarm. Something quieter and more certain than alarm. She wasn't staying away by choice. He was careful about how he looked. Torin monitored his movements. Not intrusively, not with any apparent suspicion. But Torin had been Beta Commander for long enough that vigilance had become atmospheric. Something he emitted the way the castle walls emitted cold. Direct inquiry about an Omega in the lower districts would reach Torin before nightfall. Reed had not survived 11 years of politics by being direct when indirection served better. He questioned the Dawn gate guards about foot traffic. General, routine-sounding, framed as security review. He asked the Eastern Market Patrol about incident reports from the past 3 days. He sent no one else. Did nothing that could be traced back to a specific interest in a specific person. What he learned assembled itself into a picture he didn't like. The lower districts had deteriorated further since the last formal assessment, which had itself been 6 months ago, which was 6 months too long, which was a separate problem he filed away with the precision of a man who had learned to defer guilt efficiently when there was still work to do. The winter had been harder on the Omegas than the official reports suggested. Enforcers had been running increased patrols through the district lanes, cracking down on what Torin's office was categorizing as resource misappropriation, which was the administrative language for hungry people taking what they needed to not die. 3 detainments in the past week alone. Reed read this in a report he'd requested under the cover of a routine district review, sitting at his desk in full daylight, and felt something move through him that was neither guilt nor anger but contained elements of both. He went himself that night. Not in formal armor. Dark cloak, hood up, the particular anonymity available to someone who moves with enough authority that people instinctively look away. He knew the lower districts in the abstract, maps, reports, numbers, and was discovering, as he moved through them, that the abstract and the actual were separated by a distance that the maps had not thought to measure. The cold here was different. It wasn't the clean cold of the castle's upper corridors. It was dense and damp and inhabited. The cold of too many people in too little shelter. Of walls that had never been built to hold warmth and had stopped trying. He tracked her by scent. It was harder than it should have been. Her trail was faint. The particular faintness of someone who hadn't been eating enough for the scent to carry properly, who had become, in some metabolic sense, quieter than a person should be. He followed it through 2 lanes and a collapsed archway, and into the narrow alley behind the Eastern Market's storage wall. He found her on the ground. She was conscious, barely. Her back was against the stone, her knees drawn up, her left arm, the one he had bandaged, pressed against her side in the posture of someone managing pain that had been unmanaged for too long. The bandage was gone. The wound beneath had not been looked after. 3 enforcers stood over her. He knew 2 of them. Mid-rank, Torrens division, the kind of men who performed their authority most fully when its target could not resist it. Caught her coming out of the market stores, one of them was saying, to no one in particular, in the tone of someone constructing a report in real time. Theft from licensed vendors. Omega, no documented work assignment for the current period. She's nothing, the second one said. Not to Reed, not to anyone. Just a thing said into the air, the way you say things you believe are simply true. Hannah's eyes were open. They found Reed's face across the alley. And for a moment, beneath the exhaustion and the pain and the cold, something moved through them. Not relief. Not yet. Something more fragile than that. Recognition. Step away from her. His voice came out quiet. It always did, when it mattered. The enforcers turned. He watched the precise moment they understood who they were looking at. The way the authority drained out of their posture and was replaced by something else entirely, all in the space of one breath. Alpha King. Step away, he said again, from her. The first enforcer recovered his voice before the other 2. That was either courage or poor judgment. Reed had found over the years that in men like this the distinction rarely mattered. They were the kind of men who performed better when the power was clearly on their side and struggled to recalibrate when it wasn't. Alpha King. He straightened, tried to reassemble something professional from what remained of his posture. We were conducting a routine district sweep. Detainment of an Omega found in proximity to licensed vendor storage, in suspected theft. I heard you the first time. The quiet in Reed's voice did something to the alley. It was a particular quality he had never cultivated deliberately. It had simply developed, over years of rooms that needed to be controlled, and situations that required the kind of authority that shouting only undermines. It took up space. It compressed the air around it slightly. All 3 men felt it. He watched their bodies register it before their minds did. The subtle shift in stance, the shoulders dropping a degree, the instinctive recalibration of every dominance hierarchy they carried in their bones telling them, clearly and without ambiguity, where they stood in relation to the figure in the doorway of this alley. She was found near the stores, the second enforcer tried. His voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Protocol requires... Look at her. Silence. Look at her, Reed said again, and there was something in the repetition that was worse than the first time. Measured, deliberate. The tone of a man giving someone the opportunity to understand something before he stopped being patient about it. She cannot stand. Her wound has reopened. She has been in this alley, in this cold, for... He assessed quickly, the way he assessed everything. At least 2 hours, and you are standing over her constructing a report. No one spoke. The third enforcer, younger, the one who had said nothing yet, had gone very still in the particular way of someone hoping to become difficult to notice. Reed stepped fully into the alley. It wasn't a large movement. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the authority the way lesser men reached for it. Loudly, but with demonstrations. He simply moved, and the alpha dominance moved with him, and the air pressure in the alley changed the way it changes before a storm when the atmosphere is making a decision. The 2 senior enforcers took a step back. Then another. Their knees bent. It wasn't voluntary. Reed knew it wasn't voluntary, had known since adolescence that this was what the power did when he stopped containing it, when he let it simply exist at its actual size instead of the carefully moderated version he maintained for daily function. It pressed down. It found the submission reflex that existed in every ranked wolf below him, and it applied itself to it, quietly and completely, until the body responded regardless of what the mind preferred. All three men were on their knees before he reached Hannah. He looked at them for a moment, specifically at the two senior ones, whose earlier ease had curdled into something more honest. "You harm what is mine," he said, "and you stand in front of me and cite protocol." The words fell into the silence of the alley and stayed there. "She didn't take anything." His voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. "You found her near the stores, and you chose this." A pause. "I'll remember that you chose this. Don't—" The voice was faint. Almost nothing. He turned. Hannah was looking at him from the ground, her face pale with cold and effort, her eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has been spending reserves they don't have. But her gaze was direct, clear, despite everything. "Don't hurt them," she said. Barely a whisper. They were doing what they were told. Reed looked at her for a moment. Even now. Even here, with her wound open and her body failing, and three men who had been standing over her with the full weight of institutional authority, she was asking him to spare them. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Leave," he said to the enforcers. "All three of you. Tonight's patrol is finished." They didn't need to be told twice. He listened to their footsteps disappear down the lane and did not watch them go because he had already stopped thinking about them. He crouched beside her. Up close, it was worse than it had looked from the alley entrance. The cold had been on her for too long. Her lips were pale. The arm was bad, not catastrophically, but badly enough, the kind of wound that had been quietly worsening for days, while she managed it with the insufficient resources available to someone in her position. He got one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back. She made a small sound of protest. "You can't," he said simply, not unkindly. She didn't argue further, which told him more than anything else had, exactly how much this had cost her. He stood, lifting her with a steadiness he made deliberate, not the careful movement of someone managing a fragile thing, but the unhurried certainty of someone who had no intention of putting her down. She was lighter than she should have been. That fact moved through him and settled somewhere it would not be easily dislodged. Her head came to rest against his shoulder. He wasn't certain she chose it. Exhaustion had made the decision. After a moment, barely audible against the wool of his cloak, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." Reed looked straight ahead, into the dark lane, at the snow beginning to fall again in the thin light between the buildings. "You didn't come to me," he said. She had no answer for that. Neither did he, really. He carried her out of the alley and into the night, and the snow fell around them without caring about rank or protocol or any of the careful distances two people construct when they are afraid of what closing them might mean. The first thing she registered was warmth. Not the thin, provisional warmth of a banked hearth viewed from a distance, or the borrowed warmth of wolves sleeping nearby in the lower district shelters. This was structural, built into the walls, into the thick wool blankets, into the very air of the room, which held heat the way rooms hold heat when they have never once had to choose between warmth and something else. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She lay still and let the warmth exist around her and thought, with the clear-headed practicality of someone who has learned to assess situations before reacting to them. This is not where I was. Then she opened her eyes. Stone ceiling. High. A single lamp burning low on a table beside the bed. A real bed, with a frame, with a mattress that had not compressed to nothing. A window, shuttered against the dark. A room that was plain by castle standards, and entirely unlike anything she had slept in for 2 years. She sat up. The arm had been properly dressed. Clean cloth, tight and even, the astringent smell of the same salve he had used before. Someone had also replaced her ruined outer layer with a plain wool tunic, rough but whole without tears or patches. She was in the castle. She was in the castle. She moved toward the door on instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive for 2 years, which was simply, wrong place. Move. And the door opened before she reached it. Reed stood in the frame. He was without his cloak, which was the first time she had seen him without it, and the difference was disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. He looked less like a silhouette, more like a person. He was watching her with the same focused attention she had come to recognize. But there was something different in it tonight. A quality she didn't have an immediate name for, some layer beneath the usual stillness. "You should be lying down," he said. "I need to go." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I can't be here. If anyone sees me, if Torin's people find out, Torin answers to me. I don't." The words came out before she'd finished thinking them. She stopped, recalibrated. "I mean, I have no protection here. Whatever this is, whatever you've been—" She stopped again, because she didn't have clean language for what he had been. "I'm an Omega. I don't belong in this part of the castle, and everyone who sees me here will know it." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, not blocking her path, simply entering, the way he did everything, without performance. "Sit down, Hannah." It was the first time he had used her name. She sat down. He took the chair across from her, not the bed's edge, not close, a considered distance, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing the order carefully. "You called yourself just an Omega," he said. "In the alley. The night the enforcers—" "I am an Omega." "That's not what I said." His voice was even. "I said you called yourself just one, as though it were a ceiling." A pause. "It isn't." She looked at her hands. The bandaged arm rested in her lap. "You don't have to." "I watched you every night," he said. "For 6 weeks before you knew I was there. And before that, another 2 weeks when I told myself I was simply assessing a security situation." The room was very quiet. "I watched you take the minimum. Leave portions for others. Thank an empty kitchen for bread." Something moved across his expression. Brief, controlled, but visible. "I watched you do all of that while you were starving, while you were alone, while the districts I am responsible for were failing you in every specific way a place can fail a person. That's not your—" "It is," he said. Simply. Finally. The way someone says a thing they have been carrying for a long time and have decided to stop carrying alone. "It is my fault, not all of it. But enough." The silence that followed was different from the kitchen silences. Those had been careful, provisional. This one had weight. "I made decisions during the war," he said after a moment. "Sacrifices. The kind that work strategically and cost everything in every other way." His jaw tightened slightly. 300 wolves, eastern flank. I know their names." She looked at him. "My family was in the Eastern Campaign," she said quietly. "My mother, my younger brother." He met her eyes. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, not as information but as something he had been carrying specifically, personally, told her that he had looked. That at some point in the weeks of watching her move through his kitchen he had found out exactly who she was and what the war had taken from her, and had stood in his archway night after night knowing. Something in her chest cracked open along a line she hadn't known was there. "I didn't come back," she said. Her voice was very quiet now. "To the kitchen. I heard Torin's men talking and I thought it was the only way to keep you from having to choose between—" She stopped. "I was trying to protect you from the problem of me." Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, and with a deliberateness that made it impossible to misread as accidental, he placed his hand over hers, over the bandaged arm, carefully, his palm warm and steady against her fingers. She didn't pull away. The lamp burned between them, and the snow pressed against the shuttered window, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was its own kind of language. The kind that doesn't need words, because words would only make it smaller. I have been watching from the shadows, he said finally, since the night I first saw you. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. I'm done with that. The whispers started before the week was out. This was expected. Reed had governed long enough to understand that a kingdom's opinion traveled faster than any official announcement, and that the opinion of an Alpha King's choices, particularly the ones that defied the established order, moved at approximately the speed of scandal. He had also governed long enough to know that whispers, left unaddressed, grew into something harder to manage. So he didn't address them. He simply continued, which was its own kind of statement, and let the continuation speak. Hannah stayed. Not in the room where she'd woken. That had been recovery, practical and temporary. What came after was more deliberate. Reed arranged a proper room in the castle's eastern residential wing, modest, functional, with a window that faced the inner courtyard and a hearth that worked. He told the head of household staff that she was under his protection and that her presence was not a subject open for discussion. The head of household told the kitchen staff. The kitchen staff told everyone else. Torin came to him on the 5th day. He closed the study door behind him, which meant it was going to be a real conversation rather than an administrative one, and stood across the desk with his jaw set in the familiar way. The Pack Council is asking questions, he said. Let them ask. Reed. Torin rarely used his name without the title. It was a signal when he did, a shorthand for I am speaking to you as someone who has known you for 11 years, not as your subordinate. An Omega, given formal protection, living in the residential wing. You understand what this looks like. I understand exactly what it looks like. And Reed set down the report he'd been reviewing. And I have spent 11 years making decisions this pack trusted because I had earned that trust. I am asking them to extend it once more. A pause. She stays, Torin. That isn't a discussion. Torin was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked slightly. Then, with the particular grace of a man who has decided that loyalty means knowing when to stop arguing, then I'd suggest giving her an official role, something the council can categorize. It won't silence everything, but it gives them a framework. Reed looked at him. That's a reasonable suggestion, he said. Torin almost smiled. I have them occasionally. The official role was Kitchen Resource Coordinator, a title that had not previously existed. She created to describe something Hannah had already been doing instinctively within her first week of being given any access to the kitchen's actual inventory. She cataloged everything. Not intrusively, not with the energy of someone performing usefulness, but with the quiet, systematic attention of someone who had spent 2 years understanding exactly what the gap between the castle's waste and the lower district's need actually looked like in human terms. The pre-dawn workers began finding portions waiting for them when they arrived. Not leftovers, prepared portions, set aside deliberately, before the main household's needs were calculated. A small change in sequencing that cost the kitchen nothing and meant that the people who started the day's work did so having eaten. The head cook, who had initial reservations, he found within 2 weeks that the waste logs had improved significantly. He revised his reservations accordingly. Word reached the lower districts in the way that practical good news travels, not as announcement, but as changed experience. Something is different. Something is better. The mechanism of it took longer to understand than the fact of it. Reed noticed her moving through the kitchen now with a different quality. Not the liquid, careful movement of someone minimizing their presence, but something with more weight to it. More occupation of space. She still moved quietly. That was simply her nature. But it was the quiet of someone who belonged somewhere, which is entirely different from the quiet of someone trying not to be seen. He found himself visiting the kitchen at different hours now, not the strategic pre-dawn vigils of the previous months, simply appearing at irregular times, the way a person moves through spaces that are theirs. Sometimes she was there. Sometimes she wasn't. When she was, they talked, properly at length, the conversations building on each other the way conversations do between people who have decided to stop rationing themselves. She told him about her mother, about her brother, who had been 14 when the Eastern Campaign reached their district and had not been 14 for very long afterward. She told him without performance, without the particular care people use when they want to be comforted, simply telling. And he listened the way he had learned to listen in the kitchen archway, with his full attention and without filling the silences she needed. He told her about the 300, on the names, the specific weight of a decision that was right by every strategic measure and wrong in every way that didn't show up in strategy. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. He hadn't asked her to. She said, "You remembered their names." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then they weren't lost?" He had no answer for that. He didn't need one. It had already done what it needed to do, somewhere deep and structural, in a place the list had been living undisturbed for 3 years. The Pack Council filed their formal objections and received formal responses, and gradually, with the particular exhaustion of institutions confronting a fait accompli, moved on to other concerns. The whispers didn't disappear. They simply became familiar, and familiar things lose their teeth. The lower districts did not transform overnight. Reed had no interest in pretending that one person's presence in a castle kitchen was the same as structural reform. He had spent too long working in the language of systems to mistake the symbol for the solution. But Hannah's inventory work became a model. The pre-dawn portions became policy. A formal review of Omega labor conditions was commissioned. Quietly, without fanfare, written in the dry administrative language of governance, rather than the language of penance. It was a beginning. Reed understood beginnings. They were slow and undramatic, and they were how everything that mattered had ever started. On a night in late winter, snow falling in the particular soft way it fell when the wind had decided to rest, Hannah placed a fresh loaf on the kitchen counter. Not in the discard bin, not tucked carefully under a cloak. On the counter, in the open, in the warm light of a kitchen that was hers to be in. "For whoever needs it in the morning," she said. Reed stood beside her. Not in the archway. Not in the shadows at the far end of the room. Beside her, close enough that the warmth between them was its own small climate. He looked at the bread, then at her. "You changed this place," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You stopped looking away." She paused. That was the first thing. Everything else came after. Outside, the snow fell on the castle and the lower districts without distinction. The same sky, the same cold, the same quiet blanketing everything equally. Inside, the hearth burned, and the bread sat on the counter waiting to be found, and the Alpha King of Blackridge did not stand in any shadow at all. He stood in the light, next to her. Finally, after a very long time, home. If this story found something in you, leave a comment below. Your voice is what brings the next one to life.